Physiology is a science of application. So what we do in physiology is we take really basic principles of science and we apply them to the whole body, to health, and to disease. So this skill of application is going to benefit you both for this class, but also for many of your clinical courses and at many points in health-related careers. So today we're going to discuss ways to practice this on your own in order to best prepare for this exam. So the things that we're going to do is we're going to talk about a review of different study strategies, both things you may be doing and things maybe you haven't tried yet. We're going to talk about one of those study strategies in particular. We're going to use flashcards and talk about different ways that they can be used effectively. We're going to examine note-taking in class, and then we're going to talk about how to develop and anticipate questions for self-testing. So one of the things that I find with a lot of students is that the study strategies that worked for them in their other classes don't do a good enough job of getting that information for physiology. So in physiology, we take our information that we learn and we work on applying it to new situations, new disease states, different types of applications. And so our more passive methods of studying don't really get enough use of the material so that it's really working for students. So passive methods that aren't quite enough for this class are listening in class, reading the lecture notes, reading the textbook. What you want to do is swing your study strategies more towards things that are active and really have you moving, talking, writing, using your muscles and your brains at the same time. So active methods include flashcards, so oral flashcards, so someone holds your deck or you hold your deck and you try to recite what's on the other side. One that I'll show you in a minute, which is written flashcards, using them to quiz yourself. Testing yourself by preparing some questions and asking yourself in the mirror. I recommend the mirror because of two reasons. One is that you're engaging in eye contact and some of our social skills, which really help to reinforce information. And the other reason is because if you're looking at yourself in the mirror, you know you're not looking at your notes, so you're really evaluating what you know and what you don't know. Our textbook has a website which you can search for by looking for the title of the textbook on Google, and the website will come up, and they have a really tremendous amount of study questions you can use to really evaluate whether you know your stuff or not. You can also use the questions that are included in the textbook chapters to, again, test yourself, evaluate what you know. What you don't know, you go back and relearn. The last one, the kind of gold standard, the best method of studying, is to find a partner or a group and to study on a weekly basis. So every week at the end of the week or the beginning of the next week, you sit down with your study partner or your study group and you ask each other questions. And we'll talk about how to develop these questions. But what this does for both individuals is really examines the content from the course. And the person who's developing the questions is thinking about what was important, what was stressed in lecture, and what are questions that might appear on the exam. The person who's answering the questions is getting that testing, that whether or not I know this stuff, what do I not know, what do I need to go back and examine, and then switch roles so you each get the benefit of both roles. It's the most effective form of studying because it's really dynamic, it's very engaging. And if you think about our roles as kind of the social species that we are, we learn very well in social situations. If you think about a time when you went out with your friends and you guys had a conversation, if you were trying to tell me what had happened during that time, you'd be able to probably tell me very close to word for word what happened during the conversation, who said what their tone was, what their facial expressions told you, whether they were in a good mood or bad mood. You might be able to fill in details about the surroundings and what people were wearing and what you were eating. And you didn't have to study any of these things. You never made flashcards, you never took notes. We learn in social situations. So taking a social situation and putting the lecture content in it means that you're going to get all the benefits from our natural ability to learn in social situations while you're learning physiology. So one of the popular study techniques for students is to use flashcards, and flashcards can be a great tool if they're used correctly. I see students all over campus, in Starbucks and the library, studying off their flashcards, and what they do is this. They look at the item on the front and they say, okay, secretin, oh yeah, small intestine, acid and stomach, yep, I got it. But you see, that person never really tested what they were looking at. They didn't know for sure that they got it. They were really using kind of a passive technique of reading rather than an actual testing. So what I recommend for students is a different way of using their flashcards. So now that we've seen one way of doing flashcards, let's examine another. In this way, what we do is instead of using the flashcards and flipping them back and forth, we line them up next to a piece of paper and then try to reproduce in writing what's written on the other side. This does a few things for us. One, it uses our writing to help reinforce the information. And this is one of the best tools, especially for visual learners, to study. Another thing this does is self-test. By not being able to flip over the flashcards immediately to see if we're right or wrong, it forces us to really examine what we do and don't know about what's on the other side of the card. After you've done writing, you can then flip over the cards and grade yourself to examine how much you truly understand. So let's see how much I can remember from what I've written on the back of these cards. So I'll start with secretin. Let's see, I probably wrote down the location, and the location is the small intestine. I next usually ask myself about the stimulus. So stimulus for secretin. I can't remember. I'll have to go back to that one. I always write down the action. So let's see, bicarbonate release, inhibiting gastric motility, and inhibiting acid secretion. Now I can move on to the next card. Once I've finished, I can flip over the cards and then examine what I've written down. So in this example, for both the secretin and the lipase, I realized that I don't really understand what the stimuli are. And so I write it in red and make a note that it's something I have to go back and review and then test myself again. In this way, you can go through all of your flashcards and study all the information. You not only have a written record for yourself of what you know and you don't know, but it also forces you to write, which is one of the best ways to reinforce memory. So here you can see a set of notes that look exactly as they do straight out of your printer if you download what is available on Blackboard. So this level of note-taking would be found in a student who either A, didn't come to class, or B, was very passive in class, simply listening to the lecture and following along, but not taking any of their own notes. Here you can see a set of notes that was taken by a person who clearly went to class and maybe made note of some things that I stressed while I was talking, as well as paid attention to the results of the clicker questions. So if we zoom in, we can see that this person made note while I was talking about proteins that they are vulnerable to acid, and you can see that they made a notation that acid is found in the stomach. So this would give this person some clue as to where I was going with the lecture and what I was talking about, in addition to the visual of the slides. If we pan down, we can see that this individual was engaged during the clicker question and circled the correct answer to make a note to him or herself later. And then you can see that on the last slide of this series, I presented an equation and made some kind of comments about it in class. This person told themselves to memorize this because I was talking for a long time, so it must be important. So that's a good indication that this person was not only engaged, but made a note that this was something that was stressed in lecture. Then the last thing that this person wrote down was that I talked about bicarbonate being a buffer in many systems. So this is another indication to the student that this was important, it was talked about, and it's something we'll come back to. So now let's take a look at a set of notes from a person who is really engaged in lecture and taking active notes throughout the time about the things that I was saying in reference to the slides. So if we look at the first slide in the series, you can see that this individual also noticed that I had spoken at length about the proteins and their relationship to acids, and then this person further noticed the basic chemistry involved, which is that proteins are held together by hydrogen bondings, and acid is particularly detrimental to hydrogen bonds. Thus, acids are going to be particularly effective against proteins. This person also noted that I spoke at length about enzymes, saying that enzymes break the bonds between monomers, help in the polymer to monomer deformation, and that without the enzymes, most reactions are not possible. This indicates to the student not only what the enzymes do and what their role is there, but also the emphasis on how important the enzymatic reactions are. So looking down at the second slide, which was a clicker question, this individual, as did the last set of notes, circled the correct answer, but this one made a note as to why this was the right answer. So typically during a clicker question, you guys write in your answers and then we all discuss it for a few moments. And so this individual made note of that discussion, that the reason that lipids are not digested by water is because they are hydrophobic. They form spheres that exclude water, and so we need another chemical that's going to break up those spheres. And now if we look at the last slide, again, this was the slide including that important formula that we've gone back to a few times. So during the course of me talking about this slide, this individual made some notes about the things I was saying with each one of the chemical reactions. So this individual made note of the words for the chemical formulas, so that HCO3- is called bicarbonate and H2CO3 is carbonic acid. That's important for staying involved in the rest of the conversation, should I refer back to these chemicals by just their names. This individual also made note of the fact that I mentioned that water and carbon dioxide are both products of cellular respiration, so these are going to be in our blood all the time and they form carbonic acid there. And then brought their notes to highlight what we were talking about in reference to the digestive system, that the hydrogen ions are for the stomach and bicarbonate are for the small intestine, and that they can be neutralized together. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some of the material from the course and both examine how you can develop your own questions to test yourself or a friend, and we're going to look at how questions that I've developed can be compared between questions that are more applied and questions that are relatively straightforward. So when you are looking at facts that you are thinking about memorizing, you want to apply those facts both to how the normal functioning of the human body works and what effects those facts are going to have in disease states. So for example, let's take a set of facts about the digestive system and think about some questions we can ask. So looking at the hormone secretin, which is a hormone of digestion, we would memorize the following set of facts. 1, the location of production and release, which is the small intestine. 2, the stimulus, which would be acid in the intestine. And 3, the actions of the hormone. So to inhibit acid in the stomach, inhibit stomach motility, and stimulate bicarbonate release into the small intestine. So thinking about these sets of facts, we can apply them in the following ways. 1 is to think about, why would the body want to inhibit acid release in the stomach when it senses acid in the intestines? What's the relationship between acid in the stomach and acid in the intestines? So using those same set of facts, we can ask, why would the body want to release bicarbonate into the intestine when it senses the acid there? What is the role of bicarbonate and how does it relate to acid sensation? So the last thing that we can ask about is the role of inhibiting gastric motility. So why would the body want to inhibit gastric motility when it senses acid in the intestine? How did that acid get into the intestine, and what is the relationship between acid being in the intestines and gastric motility? So next we can look at some of the questions that we could ask about this material and compare both simple questions and more applied questions. So a simple question is, what organ secretes secretin? And we know the answer is the small intestine. So an applied question that gets to the same information is, if your pancreas was removed, would secretin production be compromised? And the answer is no. We know that the small intestine makes secretin, so removal of the pancreas wouldn't really have any effect at all. So the next question that we can ask is, what stimulus triggers
secretin production? So that's the simple question. And the answer is that it's acid in the small intestine that triggers secretin production. So looking at this same information in a more applied format, we can ask, if gastric emptying was prevented by a drug, would secretin ever be produced or released? And the answer is no, since we know that gastric emptying is what brings food and acid into the small intestine. If there was no emptying, there would be no stimulus and therefore no release. The last thing that we can ask is about the actions of secretin. So the simple question is, what is or are the actions of secretin? And we know that they are to inhibit acid production in the stomach, to inhibit gastric emptying, and to encourage bicarbonate secretion into the small intestine. The more applied version of that is going to ask about the actions of secretin in a disease state. So you have been diagnosed with the duodenal ulcer, which is an ulcer in your small intestine that's caused by too much acid. Do you think that secretin has been over-secreted or under-secreted? Well, since we know that all of the functions of secretin have to do with interfering with acid in the stomach, if we're looking at a disease state that's been caused by too much acid in the stomach, then we can guess that secretin was not involved.
Okay, so we've gone over a bunch of different types of study methods, a bunch of different ways to examine how you're studying. And so what you want to do at this point is not reinvent the wheel, but you want to ask yourself how you've already been studying, what you're doing that's been successful, and then what you can do to improve upon what you usually do to prepare for an exam. So you want to take the menu of different study approaches that we looked at, and then try some of them out, and you'll feel out which ones are the best fit for you. And to answer that question of what's the best fit, what you want to do is test yourself and see how your knowledge and understanding has progressed. So use the different types of self-testing to evaluate your own study method. And when you're testing yourself, make sure that you're honest with yourself. Ask if you really understand it or if you just have a light grasp, because ultimately you're the only person who's responsible for how you do on the exam. So being a really critical evaluator of your own learning is a good step towards making sure that you're prepared. I have seen so much progress in you guys, even if it doesn't feel that way. You guys have really improved on the way that you approach this information. And what you want to do is take the things that have already been working for you and then add in the focus on application and self-testing in order to make sure that you're really doing the best job you can to prepare yourself for the final. Good luck, and I'll see you guys in lecture.